Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Albert Cho. The Munich Security Conference is a crucial platform for countries to discuss their perspectives on global security. The 2025 conference brought together over 800 representatives, with the U.S. Vice President Vance's remarks drawing global attention. The contrast between U.S. unilateralism and China's multipolar approach became a central topic of the discussions. Amid the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war and the transition of U.S. leadership, how will the post-Munich dynamics shape U.S.-China relations? What were the key topics of the Japan-U.S. South Korea Trilateral meeting on the sidelines of the conference? Joining us today are Wang Kai-chun, KMT Department of International Affairs Assistant Director, and Lev Nachman, National Taiwan University Graduate Institute of National Development Assistant Professor. A very warm welcome to both on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's start the discussion with a speech by U.S. Vice President Vance. The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia. It is not China. It is not any external actor. What I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. So my first question is, U.S. Vice President Vance stated at the Munich Security Conference that the real threat facing Europe is from within. So what's your comments on this, Mr. Wang?
So, I do believe, the EU is engaging with the new administration with new priorities. Some of them are reasonable, for example, when it comes to security contribution to the alliance in general. But there are others that I would say are long ideological differences between, the conservative parties or politics in the United States, as well as what the Europeans are value the most. So, for example, in things like, I do believe there's a preferences for some of the European authorities and also the European institutions to regulate a lot of things for good intentions. But you may have, for example, conservative opinions in the United States that would say this is a trampling of, for example, individual liberty, spaces, and all these different things. So, unfortunately, we see that kind of openly plays out in the forum.
Mm-hmm. Professor Nachman, what's your comments on this, Vice President Vance's kind of critique or, strong kind of opposing to its allies in NATO?
This idea that the biggest enemy is coming from within, I think represents sort of this very real split in the Republican Party, where once upon a time, the idea of needing a global led order by the United States was a priority for both Democrats and Republicans. But in recent years, we've seen more and more Republicans lean into isolationism. The idea that we need to not focus on the rest of the world and instead need to look inwards at the expense of looking outwards to any degree. And what I think Vice President Vance's comments really reflect is how the second Trump administration is going to lean very heavily into the idea of, if we're going to work with our allies, it's only going to be under very particular conditions, and that the priority is going to be looking inwards, not outwards.
Maybe I should ask the same question in this way. To what extent do you think that the foundation of trust between the U.S. and Europe is eroding?
I think after this particular speech, there's more and more comments coming from Europe about how is Europe going to look forward without the United States.
Okay.
And I think that's very telling. The idea that Europe is no longer going to guarantee, or we should not assume that there's going to be deep cooperation, not just because of Vance's words, but because of much of the action we've seen from the Trump administration so far, especially when it comes to issues like Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a, by the way, topic I would like to ask both of you is that we know that the electoral outcome from Germany, just came out, and the radical right, the ultra-right, actually gained some benefits from this election. So could you both comment on this, and how is that going to impact the U.S.-EU relations, specifically with Germany?
Well, yes, I just saw the result this morning, but unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of time to kind of look deep into the Germany's domestic politics. Mm-hmm. But from my very shallow understanding is that, it's an interesting split between the past. East Germany and also West Germany, there's a stark contrast in terms of the political preferences at this moment. Mm-hmm. So I do believe, Germany being the leading EU member state is going to face a lot of, they have a lot of important political questions that need to address by themselves, but also at the same time, unfortunately, you do have, external comments about the politics in Germany and so forth. So, I do believe this election result kind of sees how there is a drastic rise to the right that basically says they don't like the status quo.
Professor Nachman?
Yeah, so there's the glass half full perspective and the glass kind of very empty perspective. The empty perspective is that the far right party doubled their vote share to over 20% in this election. The glass half full perspective, though, is that the Conservative Party and the far right party are not the same party. And I think it's really important that we remember that they are not the same party, because I don't think it's likely we're going to see a coalition that wants to work with the far right party. That being said, though, it is extremely concerning that the far right party still is able to double their vote share.
Right.
Thankfully, because of the way that Germany's political system works, it's a proportional representation system. It doesn't mean that, the far right party is going to actually be able to control policy. But what kind of coalition we're going to see in Germany and whether or not we're going to see this momentum for the far-right party grow, I think is something that's very concerning and something we should all be paying attention to.
Would you say the electoral results will lead to the consequence that the Germans' foreign policy is going to be more in line with Trump's foreign policy in the future?
Only because they don't have enough for a coalition, and I would be very surprised if the Conservative Party works closely with them, especially with foreign policy. I don't think we're there yet. Instead, what I think we're going to see is still a realignment among European powers to see what the European force is going to look like when dealing with Donald Trump, rather than Germany working unilaterally with the United States.
Okay. Munich Security Conference Chairman Christoph Heusgen described this year's conference as European nightmare, following U.S. Vice President Vance's speech. So how do you interpret the underlying significance of this statement? Does it signal a breakdown in shared values between the U.S. and Europe? Mr. Wang?
I think, unfortunately, we do see a sign of that happening. The speech is both surprising and unsurprising for me personally. The surprising part, of course, is how this security conference is supposed to be focusing, on the Ukraine war and also basically things related to the conflict in general. But the vice president has spoke less about Russia and Beijing, more about European community. So, but that is the unsurprising part of that, is that he basically expressed, when I spent a lot of time in D.C. back in the days, there is a looming frustration when it comes to why is it that the European part of the NATO is not increasing their defense sharing, for example. So, that just unfortunately openly plays out in this conference.
Professor Nachman?
Yeah, the idea of shared values, I think, is a concept that's going to become less and less salient for the foreign policy community. It's become very clear that the Donald Trump administration is not operating off of shared values, but instead off of particular interests that the United States have, of which, shared democratic values is not a priority. Instead, we see, trade deficits and future potential trade benefits being the priority, not what is your regime type and what are your core values as a country.
The U.S. and its European allies are facing serious divisions over shared values and how to address the Ukrainian crisis, with the new U.S. administration shifting its strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific to counter China. Some observers believe this signals the potential to end the NATO unity under U.S. leadership. So how do you view this development, Mr. Wang?
I think it's a little bit too early to comment whether or not the U.S. leadership is going to entirely vaporize away or whether NATO will collapse. There are moments when this alliance, after the Cold War, went into serious doubts, right? For example, you have the French president who once said NATO was brain dead, but now NATO has been revived by this very existential conflict that's happening just right outside the step door of Europe. There is a possible shift of U.S. attention, basically means a new phase of this alliance. You might see more European countries stand up and join the initiative of NATO. So, we definitely see what's going to happen. Well, I mean, they're still going to increase their defense spending. And I do believe they're still going to integrate more of their systems together to guarantee at least they have some sense of deterrence within the European story themselves.
Are we going to, Professor Nachman, to see the end of NATO unity under the U.S. leadership really soon?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the United States is whether or not they're actively playing less of a role, or if European countries just no longer want them to actively play a leadership role. Which, from Ukraine's perspective is of course very worrying, because the United States' support is really fundamental to Ukraine's ability to succeed. At the same time, I do think there is going to be a new level of solidarity amongst European countries, knowing that the United States is no longer the ally it once was, and instead we as European countries need to now sort of come together during this very pivotal moment.
In his speech, Wang Yi stated that China and Europe are partners, not rivals. This message stands in stark contrast to Vance's remarks presenting Europe with two greatly different narratives. How should we interpret the shift in transatlantic and EU-China relations following this conference?
Yeah, it's a good question. Beijing does see an opportunity to kind of posing itself as a responsible global actor in a way. But I do think the European Union or the European community understands this principle when they're approaching China, both from the economic and also political perspectives, right? So you see Europe still impose tariffs on the EVs that are coming from China. You still see the EU is launching a lot of investigations on the dumping the biofuels, or when it comes to steels, for example. So I do believe if China wants to kind of step in, and also, by the way, you still have European communities sanctioning Chinese companies and North Korean individuals because of the war in Ukraine. So I don't believe that the European Union as an institution will kind of drastically shift to China. Whether or not it's going to slowly goes into China's way, the European community is a collective membership, right? So I don't think there's going to be too much of a lower down of their expectations on China when they're interacting with them going forward.
Professor Nachman?
I think from a political communication perspective and how I think the average person may see China and Europe is definitely going to change, especially because of the stark contrast this comes compared to Donald Trump. From a purely PR perspective, every time Donald Trump or J.D. Vance opens their mouths and comes out with this very hot and loaded America First rhetoric, and then China responds with this very friendly rhetoric, I really think it just makes the PRC look more friendly than the United States at a time when, 4 years ago, we would have perceived the opposite to be true.
So you're likely to see a new alliance between EU and China, kind of not in line with Donald Trump's every single policy in the future?
I would not say an alliance, no, because I agree with my colleague here that we're not going to see major political changes, but purely from how the average person in Europe sees China compared to the United States, I think we might see differences in public opinion in the coming years.
At the Munich Security Conference, Wang Yi emphasized that a multipolar world is both a historical inevitability and a reality, and called for the advancement of an equal and orderly multipolar world. Does this indicate that China is actively shaping a new global order? What is the strategic intent behind this push?
Well, I mean, history is a very long concept. No orders can last forever. And we definitely see China is actively trying to reshape the global order for a very long time. And I do believe that currently they do sense there's another moment of opportunities to go forward. I think the Chinese strategy is very straightforward, right? Wherever the U.S. retreats, it steps forward and potentially double down on what the U.S. is doing when it comes to global contribution. So, but again, the fact that President Trump won not both in the popular votes and also in the electoral votes kind of signal that to his administration's firm belief that he needs to prioritize American interests. And that will cause some opening when it comes to the China stepping in and take advantage of this.
Professor?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that Wang Yi and the PRC actively want a multipolar world. I think every action they've taken over the last 2 years indicate the opposite, that they would like to be sort of the global hegemon. But because the American rhetoric these days is very aggressive, it just, again, like my previous comments, makes the PRC seem like they're going to be the more friendly and the more amicable global leader at this time.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Japanese Foreign Minister Takashi Iwaya, and South Korean Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yu held their first trilateral meeting on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. This marks the first U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral meeting since Trump took office. In their joint statement, they reaffirmed the unshakable nature of U.S., Japan, South Korea partnership, emphasizing the need to address North Korea threats. So my question for both of you is that the U.S., Japan, and South Korea reaffirmed their commitment to North Korea's denuclearization and reiterated their stance on sanctions against Pyongyang. Will these sanctions and diplomatic pressure be effective against North Korea? Professor?
Goodness, I hope so, but I truly don't know because unfortunately, I think it's really going to be up to what Donald Trump has to say at any given moment. What we've seen so far is that even though Marco Rubio may say XYZ on any given day, there's always the potential that Donald Trump will come in and change the entire American approach. For example, we know that Donald Trump has been susceptible to praise from North Korea, and that he sees himself as someone who can be a moderator in sort of this part of the world with regards to North Korea. So even if right now South Korea, Japan, and the United States put forth this very strong messaging of "we are united," I am unsure if that will stay the way for the next 4 years.
Mr. Wang?
So I do believe, one of the biggest challenges in unpredictability is the fact that, number one, you have a new U.S. administration that perhaps have different priorities when it comes to DPRK. You have a new Japanese administration, which is the minority government, and you have a South Korean leadership president who awaits for impeachment trials. The statements that they made, it does look positive, but perhaps if you move forward another 1 or 2 years, when you perhaps will see another reshuffle in Korean and Japanese politics, fundamentally, I think the Koreans and the Japanese have to come together with a sort of consensus and trying to convince Washington with different priorities at this moment, to see whether or not they can continue to ramp up or maintain their current pressure on DPRK or entirely shift the direction.
Well, actually, I wonder what's the primary opponents to countries like Japan and South Korea at this point of time? Is it going to be China still, or kind of shift? There's a possibility of the enemy shifting to DPRK, as you mentioned, Professor?
I think my focus is actually less on who is going to be, the primary enemy or a primary rival, and instead, what I'm really focused on is sort of the retreat from multilateralism that really defined the Joe Biden presidency, and instead, what we're seeing from Donald Trump, which is again this return to isolationism, because it doesn't matter who the number one enemy is or the number one rival is. If we're not coordinated and we're all acting very separately from each other, then that's going to be very difficult for us to see a peaceful future for the region.
So what is Trump's calculation? Does he, wants to fight against individual enemies just on his own, or like what he suggested, he's not interested in kind of form a coalition at all whatsoever to do the same job? What's his calculation to your speculation?
So I wish I knew his calculations. From what we know so far, it seems what deal can be made here. Not who is the enemy, but instead what kind of benefit can America get out of this dynamic relationship with whoever it happens to be that we're engaging with.
Mr. Wang?
Yeah, it's kind of, I really agree with what my colleague has said. Trump, the Trump administration 1.0, he completed his first stage with the trade negotiation with the Japanese, and then he tried to renegotiate the burden sharing of U.S. troops stationed in Japan, right? So, I do believe, even though I do have to say that, yes, the current Seoul and Tokyo does still see Beijing as a military threat, given how China continues to have a lot of complicated and dynamic military activities around the Diaoyudao Senkaku Island region, and also the fact that, DPRK continues to be supported by Beijing to a certain extent. But yes, there is a great challenge when it comes to these two East Asian capitals on how do you balance your biggest security guarantor, and what are their roles in the future when it comes to jointly deter what they see as military threats?
Do you guys agree with the notion that Trump is not interested in this, East Asian region, other than the kind of urgent enemy China is? Would you say that Trump is not going to put a lot of efforts in East Asia, but going to do something else, like what you said, the trade deficits and all those kind of trade issues, Professor?
I have absolutely no idea how Donald Trump feels about this part of the world because it seems like his opinion about this part of the world changes fairly regularly. And even though when his attention is not on this part of the world, Marco Rubio is able to have more agency in how the United States conducts itself. When Trump's attention does turn back over here, that's when we introduce a lot of unknowns. And it's when Donald Trump eventually does turn his attention back this way that I think we're going to really see a very different dynamic from the United States in this part of the world.
Mr. Wang?
I think it's very likely that the bureaucrats from all these countries with very common, shared ideas about Northeast Asian security structures and the military leaderships and folks are going to still maintain a certain extent of interoperability and also joint deterrence. But yes, if President Trump decided that, okay, he needs to shift his attention to Asia, then we're entering a very transactional phase of what the region is going to experience. So expecting more, perhaps, trade negotiations, expecting more demands from particular industries to either reshore back to the United States or to perhaps, accept a certain degree of tariffs.
How will the U.S. Japan South Korea alliance under the Trump administration impact security dynamics in the Northeast Asia? We kind of focus on the security kind of dilemma, especially between China and Taiwan and the two Koreas, Professor?
I really am hoping that there is still going to be active dialogue between South Korea and Japan, and especially the Philippines going forward, but that's going to become increasingly difficult. South Korea has an election coming up this year, and we know that the Conservative Party is absolutely not going to win, which means that it's going to very much change the dynamic between Japan and South Korea, which is also going to change the dynamic regionally of Japan, South Korea, America, and the Philippines. So given that Donald Trump's attention varies day by day, I really think we're going to see a very different dynamic in this next year.
Mr. Wang?
Yeah, so within this region, I think, unfortunately, back in the days when with the previous U.S. administration is mostly about a holistic approach on China or a regional issue, but nowadays we kind of return to a very fragmented bilateral, one versus one and the other one versus one set of relationship that's going on. So I do expect in the future all the Asian capitals, one of their biggest priority will be, how do they effectively engage with Washington and try to see what is the best deal or perhaps what is the best way to convince this new administration to the best of their ability to achieve a win-win scenario.
It was that the U.S. Japan South Korea alliance formed under Biden might weaken under Trump. However, the three nations reaffirmed their ties at the Munich Security Conference. Does this signal stability in the Northeast Asia geopolitical landscape, even though both of you kind of expressed a pessimistic view on this? But will I still wonder North Korea be deterred in this alliance? Professor?
Probably not, because there's so much conflicting messaging coming from the United States. Like, it's very difficult to hear Marco Rubio affirm alliances in this part of the world and hear J.D. Vance say that the number one enemy is from within our countries and that we need to look inwards, not outwards. So reconciling these two very different perspectives from the United States, I think, is really going to be a challenge, and it's going to be one that I think the PRC and North Korea look at and say, great. Look at how divided and unsure we are, or the Americans are at this moment.
Mr. Wang?
So yes, the strong contrast between particular high-ranking U.S. officials in one scenario and the other, I think the DPRK is going to look into is the next phase, which is what are the actions that are going to come forward. Is there going to be still a very massive scale of joint military exercise in South Korea or within the region? I think North Korea is going to look into that as well. You talk the talk and you walk the walk. So if somehow President Trump, like his first term, kind of also with the consensus of the then South Korean administration, scaled down the joint military exercise, I think that will send a particular signal to DPRK.
Given the unpredictable and also unknown future of the Northeast Asia, we are concerned with Taiwan's position in the whole game. What kind of policy would you guys suggest to the Lai administration, perhaps different from Tsai Ing-wen's administration, that perhaps we should keep it low, keep it low key, that we don't say so much about we are democracy alliance with Japan, with South Korea, with the United States, or maybe we should take a different approach, kind of keep it low and try to avoid confrontation with China. What kind of approach do you think is better for Taiwan to do, Professor?
I would probably hear your comments and say that now is not the time to necessarily be loud, and that quiet might be the best approach while we see what exactly Donald Trump's intentions are towards Taiwan. Second, for the last 8 or 9 years under Tsai Ing-wen, so much of Taiwan's international PR has been about a democracy with shared values with other democracies around the world. And we see very clearly that that messaging isn't going to work with Donald Trump. That trying to appeal to Trump based off of shared values isn't really going to win over his heart and mind, and we're going to see just as many tariff threats, whether or not we say that we're a like-minded democracy as opposed to if we don't.
So that's not a solution anymore, the like-minded partners with the United States from Taiwan's perspective, Mr. Wang?
So unfortunately, I think we are entering into a damage control situation. I personally do not believe, and I really hope in the future that the Lai administration will have a better communication channel with Washington, D.C. And secondly, I do hope that as we are about to enter a very tough, perhaps, negotiation with the Trump administration, both sides have very good reasons to stand on their grounds. One of the things I really hope this administration is not going to sacrifice TSMC. It's not going to sacrifice our core national interests. I really wish that the administration will identify what is our core national interests, trying to keep them in Taiwan, keep us competitive, and keep us crucial within the region.
Okay, Mr. Wang and Professor Nachman, thank you for your great insights in the show. Like our show, stay tuned and subscribe to Taiwan Talks. See you soon.